On this episode, we're going to be talking about why starting a podcast for your brand or business is beneficial to scaling your business, products, and services, and how to get started for absolutely free. Stay tuned.
This is the Podcast in the Rough. Tune in every Friday for new adventurous episodes.
Welcome to the Podcast in the Rough. I'm your host, Zebulon Thomas, and this is episode 124. I want to talk to you about the importance of today's digital landscape, and that is podcasting. Podcasting has gained significant importance in today's digital landscape for several reasons. Podcasts are readily available to a global audience through various platforms and devices. It allows businesses and creators to find more of their niche audience and connect with them on a deeper level. It gives you the ability to build your brand's voice and identity. Podcasts are often long-form content, allowing for in-depth discussions, especially valuable for businesses looking to educate their audience on their products and services. And the most important part of podcasting that I feel is by far the best reason to podcast, and that is the opportunity to build a community of raving fans. So that's just to name a few. Stay with me and let's dive into this right now. So I want to talk about the power of podcasting, and I want to give you a few key statistics here that I hope get you to think more in depth about why you should start podcasting. Podcasting has become extremely popular, and it's only going to grow with an estimated of 100 million listeners to be tuning into podcasts from all over the world by 2024. The podcast industry is projected to be worth approximately $4 billion by 2024. We are in an incredible time right now to have technology at our fingertips, and podcast sits right there at the top in the middle for us to take advantage of. So let's dive into taking advantage of podcasting and why you should get started right away. Podcasting is a valuable marketing tool, and here's how it helps you. It helps you reach your target audience. It'll help you build authority and trust within your niche. It'll help you showcase your expertise, and it will establish a deeper connection with your audience. Again, this is your podcast, your show. You can put on one heck of a show with your podcast. It's however you want it to be. Create that experience for your audience. Now let's talk about starting your podcast for free. Here are some ways to get started with podcasting on a budget. When it comes to equipment, there's a lot of microphones, a lot of mixers, and trust me, I have endless amounts of microphones and I've used countless mixers, and I kind of love them all. But to save you time and money, I recommend using your smartphone and a free recording app. That is how I got started. There is importance on the quality of your audio, so here are some small recommendations from me to help you get that high quality using your smartphone and a free recording app. But when it comes to capturing the audio quality, I highly recommend recording on your smartphone in your car. You get in your car, roll up the windows, don't have the car on, and you use that as a sound booth. It'll really help you get rid of some of that background noise and reverb and room bounce, if you will. Now, if you don't have a vehicle, you can simply stand inside your closet with all the clothes in there, and that will also dampen the sound of the background and your voice bouncing around the room. So you cut back on that reverb and speak clearly and closely into your phone. And that'll give you that clear quality audio. It's so important to get quality audio, and you can do that using a smartphone. And again, this is how I got started with my podcast. When it comes to hosting and distribution of your podcast, once you've recorded your first episode, I suggest using free platforms like Anchor or Podbean. Editing and production of your podcast is going to be the most time-consuming part about podcasting, but at the beginning, if you're just using your smartphone and you're nailing it and you're not having to do a lot of editing, you'll save time. But if you have to edit your podcast, then I recommend free editing software like Audacity. Absolutely free. There's plenty of tutorials on YouTube that you can find. Now I want to cover the importance of compelling podcast cover art and intro music. I suggest using free tools and music libraries. Some of the free tools you can use is an app that I absolutely love, and that's called InShot, and it's available for free on the App Store. And you can create some really awesome graphics and text and visuals to create your podcast cover art. When it comes down to the intro music of your podcast, I would use music libraries that are free, and make sure you read that you can use them on podcasts. Make sure that you can use them royalty free so that your podcast is not being taken down or blocked in other countries or have some restrictions on them. You can get away with using the YouTube library if you're doing a podcast on YouTube. And I've had great success with that on my own podcast, and I haven't experienced any snags or limitations. When it comes to podcasting, strategies for growing your podcast are important. And I want to give you a few of my tips for increasing your podcast reach. First off, consistency. I stress the importance of regular episodes because if you have a schedule and you can stick to it, so will your audience. And that'll give them something to plan for, block out time in their day to listen to your episode. Even if they're not listening to it when you first release it, they will at least block out it in the hours or the day after you've released it to catch up. And so this gives them a schedule to follow when you're uploading at a regular basis. So make sure you're consistent with your podcast episodes and you post regularly. And if you're going to miss an episode, make sure you inform your listeners on social media and give them something else to talk about. For promoting your podcast, turn to your social media outlets for free promotional tools. There's so many tools on social media in the platforms that we use that are right at your fingertips and they don't cost you any money. Platforms like TikTok and Instagram and using the YouTube Shorts are going to be highly beneficial for promoting your podcast and all the episodes you're going to be sharing. On those platforms, I highly encourage that you engage with your audience. When you post something, make sure you're asking a question. Everything should have a CTA, and that CTA could be follow me on Instagram, like this post, comment below, follow the podcast, tune in for the next episode. Encourage engagement with your audience by asking questions and getting some feedback. And when they post a comment or interact with your content, make sure that you're responsive as fast as possible, and that will help you really grow your podcast. Another strategy for growing your podcast is collaborations. It's very important, and there's so many benefits to having guest interviews and cross-promotion of your podcast. When you have guests on, especially if they have a podcast, well, then you're sharing in the viewership. Their audience and your audience are now mixing together, which will increase the growth and popularity of your podcast. But if you have a guest that doesn't have a podcast yet, that doesn't mean they don't have a following. So you still have a potential to grow your audience by having guests on and having them promote to your following, and that cross promotion will lead to growing your podcast audience. And when you have a podcast audience established, it doesn't matter how big or small it is, I highly encourage audience interaction through feedback and questions. Make sure when you do post, you give the option for them to give you feedback and you ask those questions, and then even share those questions and that feedback on the next episode to help them become more involved in your podcast and the development and production of your podcast. Now, I want to talk about finding the right podcast name. This is a very important step in the podcast creating process. And if you can get this down, you're going to be well on your way to a successful podcast launch and have many, many successful episodes. So I want to discuss the significance of your podcast name. Branding and SEO rank is so important. A well-chosen name with a high SEO score can help with discoverability of your podcast. So I recommend searching for an SEO name checker and check the names that you have on your list. So what I did is I created several names for what I wanted my podcast to be. Things that revolved around my interest, the things I want to talk about, and how far I wanted to take the podcast. And then once I had those names narrowed down to, like, say, my top 10, I went into an SEO checker website and I narrowed down those names by searching them as a domain name to see what one got me the highest SEO rank. For me, the Podcast in the Rough ranked extremely high on the SEO, and so it was a no-brainer for me. And then I went over and bought the domain for my website because you want your podcast name to be the same as your domain so that when you're promoting this, it's very easy and searchable. Then once you have the name of your podcast, go search for the best keywords relevant to your niche. Use tools like NameCheck to check the domain and social media availability. And I want to stress that you find a unique name. Don't just go with what ranks best. Keep working the name of your podcast until you find something that you love, it sounds good, it stands out, and it ranks at least over 50% on the SEO. When I first got started, I didn't even have a domain or a website for my podcast. I simply just used my YouTube channel and my social media outlets with my phone. And over time, I shared with my audience that I was going to be improving my microphone and I was going to move into some mixers, and then I was going to advance into getting a website domain and I was going to start a Facebook group. And I started to slowly grow this, but I made sure that I kept my audience in the loop with me and became a part of my foundation. And so that's how I developed raving fans within my podcast, so that when I want to do something big or network or promote something, I get the response and the feedback that I've earned over the years. Podcasting is extremely fun, and it's very beneficial if you have a business or if you're someone that's trying to generate an extra stream of income. This will give you leverage to be able to do that, because you're going to be able to build a community, go more in depth with your listeners, and it's easy to promote. Plus, like I said, we're doing this on a budget, absolutely free. There's no reason why you can't get started with a podcast right now. And always, if you want to build out your podcast from start to success, I highly recommend that you join my podcast community mastermind group. It's absolutely free. Head on over to thepodcastintherough.com/learn, and let's get started with your podcast. Don't forget to stay tuned, subscribe to this podcast, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the Podcast in the Rough. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care. This is the Podcast in the Rough.